Hi, everybody. Welcome to week five. 5 out of 6, we're almost done. We only have really 4 more class sessions here, and then it's it. I should just let you guys know this is going to be a rough week because we're talking about political violence today, and on Thursday, we're going to talk about human rights. So strap in. We got a lot to talk about and a lot of really important things to talk about, but it's not going to be easy stuff to talk about. So what we're going to talk about today with political violence is the chapter covered tons of types of political violence. We're only going to look at 2 examples today, and this is not exhaustive of anything, and there are lots of types of political violence. We're just going to look today at terrorism and genocide. How do I put this? Two types of political violence that there's not a lot of conversation around in terms of do we like this? Do we not like this? It's pretty universal that terrorism is bad, genocide is bad. That's why we're going to look at those today. It ignores a lot of the debates about some of the things you saw in there about whether war is good or not, And those are good conversations to have, just not one we're going to have today. We're just going to talk about 2 types of political violence that we just basically say terrorism, no good. Genocide, no good. What do we do about? What are they? What do we do about it? So where I want you to think before we get started here is I want you to think about last week we talked about global governance, and we talked about this concept called the public good. Public goods, if you remember, it's a thing that is non-excludable and non-rivalrous. So if you have those 2 things, you have a public good. And public goods tend to be underprovided because of the free rider problem. So a lack of violence is a public good at the international level. At the national level, but also today we're talking about the international level. So peace is essentially a public good that is actually really underprovided. And so we want to ask and answer the questions about how do you then go about providing this underprovided public good? So let's start by talking about what peace is. There are 2 types of peace. Again, there's probably lots of different types of peace, but we're going to talk about 2 different types of peace here. One is what we call negative peace, and negative peace is just the absence of war. We don't mean negative in a positive, that sucks sort of way. We mean negative in the sense of something is absent. So negative peace is just the absence of war. So, for example, right now in the United States, we're not really at war. The war on terror doesn't really count. The war on poverty, the war on drugs, doesn't really count as war. We're not fighting another state in a war right now. We're in negative peace. So the question then becomes, okay, cool. Have we achieved peace? Well, there's a second kind of peace we need to talk about as well. It's a really important type of peace, probably the one that we mean more than just not war. And that's what we call positive peace. And that's improving the conditions that reduce the likelihood of violence. We have to think about what are the reasons why people go to war? How then do we create conditions in which that is less likely? But not just war. That's the other thing that positive peace adds to it. It's not just about that very particular type of political violence. We're talking about all kinds of political violence. All the things that we can do to sort of reduce political violence. The main thing that we have out in the world right now to help us try to solve this under provision of this public good of positive peace is this thing called the United Nations. That's really what it exists for. It exists for provision of to help with the provision of both these kinds of peace. And we talked about, again, last week, how international institutions can help solve collective action problems and help provide underprovided public goods. The purpose of the United Nations, it does tons of things. We'll talk about that in a second. But the main purpose of it, the reason it exists, is to handle threats to international peace and security. Now, this is a very specific kind of thing, international peace and security. So if there's a civil war going on, technically it's not the UN's position. However, if the UN decides that civil war could spill over into an international war, now the civil war is part of it. And what the United Nations has basically determined is that there are tons of things that can do that. So when it was first created, its main goal was negative peace, stopping war. World War II is just over. There was nuclear weapons in the world now. there was this decision made to create the United Nations as a way of trying to prevent a World War III from happening where nuclear weapons would start flying and it'd be messy. It was just a very simple idea of let's create this thing that will help us achieve negative peace. Over time, what has happened is that the purpose of the UN has evolved to be much more about trying to achieve positive peace, actively stopping threats before they come, actively stopping threats before they become threats. And there are lots of things that could do that. And let me just give you an example. Let's just say, for example, there's a tsunami, and a tsunami hits a particular area, and it causes a lot of deaths. It causes a lot of people to have economic hardship, political, and that then turns people into refugees. So a number of people are going to be refugees. That could then stir up problems in an area, which can lead to violence, political violence, sort of locally. It could also go across borders and cause international violence. And so what the UN has basically determined over time is that a tsunami is not just a local thing, it's a thing that needs to be thought about in terms of how do we reduce these, how do we stop these threats before they become threats. And so, for example, an early warning system about tsunamis can provide this positive peace right here. That's sort of the argument there. And then there's tons of things that are in this as well. Let me just show you a quick thing here. You don't need to know this. This is just the United Nations system. The United Nations is a whole bunch of international institutions within this larger institution. So we know the sort of the big parts of it, like the Security Council and the General Assembly, but there's lots of other things. This is not a very clear picture here, but so for example, let me see if I can find it on here. The World Health Organization, which is working on pandemics, and when it's not working on pandemics, it's working on inoculations against things like polio, measles, things like that. Here's the World Meteorological Organization, which its job is to basically do weather so that we can prevent those things from turning into threats down the line. And there's just tons of other things like this. You guys have probably heard of UNICEF, like which works with children. You've heard of UNESCO, which works with cultural ideas and things like that. The United Nations Population Fund, which deals with population growth. Like there's all these things because if the UN's not doing these things, then these public goods are going to be underprovided. Think of it this way. If the UN wasn't this thing out there responsible, the states gave power to the UN so the UN could deal with refugee crises, who would deal with refugees? The answer is nobody really would. It's everybody's problem, so it turns out to be nobody's problem, and it'd be underprovided, a public good that'd be underprovided. So if we care about refugees, for example, the UN sort of plays a role in that. So we're going to talk about two particular kinds of political violence here. You're going to watch a longer video here on terrorism. It's about the terror attacks that happened in Europe a few years ago. And again, just give this idea of what terrorism is. We kind of know what terrorism is because we pay attention to the news just a little bit. But I want you to think about what actually is terrorism, what causes it, how do you go ahead and fix that? We'll come back and talk about that after you watch the video.